So, I decided to go hiking one day in a state park. It's a place that I'm extremely familiar with. The weather has been awful lately though, so I haven't been kayaking. My time in the state park has been spent kayaking. I was the only person out there because the weather wasn't great. I was on the Orange Trail, maybe 2 miles in, when all of a sudden I had the feeling of just being watched. I do have a bit of a sixth sense for this. If I feel like I'm being watched, there's an 80% chance that I am being watched. So I stopped, watched for a second. As I started back in, I suddenly saw quick-paced movement out in the brush, maybe 50 yards from where I was. Something was trying to avoid being seen. Weird. I continued on though. As I walked down the trail, I continued to feel watched, when all of a sudden as I'm walking, I hear a maniacal laughter out in the brush, maybe 20 yards to my left. Now, I was the only person around. I hadn't seen another person in the entire park, and this really unsettled me. I quickly moved on. I tried to put it out of my mind, thinking that I must have just imagined it. But maybe 2 minutes later, I hear the same maniacal laugh off to my left, this time a bit closer. I decided at this that I need to pick up the pace substantially. Less than a minute later, I hear the laughter right behind me, and there's an enormous amount of rustling and noise coming from the brush. I realize that whatever this was now right behind me, and I just ran. I didn't look back, I just legged it. Something was telling me to run, and run as far as I could. Within a mile, I was sucking wind. I had put every ounce of energy into my escape. I ended up becoming too weak to run. I stopped for a rest. I didn't want to get bull rushed, so I turned around, faced the direction that I'd been running from, and I took a knee. I was starting to calm down, but I still didn't feel safe, I guess. I told myself that I had to keep going. As I struggled to my feet, I spotted something in the brush. A dark leather wrap. I unfolded it and found 3 extremely sharp knives in there, like butcher knives. The type of knife that you would use to, I guess, stab someone. They looked like they'd only been put there recently too. You could tell that they'd been dropped there within maybe a day or so. I let out an audible yelp when I realized what was inside the sheath. Really manly, I know, but anyway, all of a sudden, every ounce of fear came rushing back. My body was telling myself to be very, very afraid. I knew then, too, that I had to keep moving. So I jumped up and I ran back to civilization. I didn't grab the knives because I felt like it would add an immense amount of risk to an already dangerous situation. I had the feeling of being watched until maybe I was half a mile from the trailhead. Something or someone was out there, and something or someone knew that I was out there too. I'm not really scared of much. People don't really have the ability to freak me out, but the fact that my body was telling me to be really scared, to keep moving no matter what, was terrifying to me. It was nothing short of a primal response that I just couldn't turn off. This happened in Boston in 2013. I, now 30 female, 23 at the time, was looking for an apartment with a roommate, same age. We had a pretty tight budget, so rather than using a realtor, we replied to ads on Craigslist. It wasn't my first time using Craigslist for this, and having come across my fair share of creeps, I made it a point to never go to tours alone, and to make sure someone who wasn't coming with me knew the address of where I was touring. So, we scheduled an appointment to meet with someone to view a 1-bedroom that was open in a 3-bedroom house in Dorchester. We get there, get inside the front door, and he told us to wait in the foyer. I like to think that I have pretty good intuition, and the place immediately felt very creepy. He said that the open bedroom is in the guest house in the backyard, but it looked more like a garage if I'm being honest. Then he said that his neighbor has been asking to move into the open room and he doesn't want her to know that he's letting other people tour it. So when we go to the backyard to see the guest room, we should try to walk as quickly as possible so she doesn't notice in the event that she was looking outside. All the red flags were going off. And then he told us that he'd go back there first and tell us when it's okay to head over. He leaves, a minute or two go by, and through a window we can see a few other guys that we didn't see before head to the garage. Obviously, huge red flags at that. Me and my roommate look at each other and, without even having to say a word, immediately leave the foyer and walk to our car. We get in the car, lock the doors, and drive away as quickly as we can. About 5 minutes later, he calls us and asks us why we left. He sounded really upset and told us that we wasted his time and blah blah blah. I know in my gut, though, that he did not have good intentions, and to this day, I wonder what would have happened if we went to the tour in the garage. When I was 9 years old, I lived in Mexico, and let's just say that it wasn't a particularly peaceful year when it came to crime. At that point, I was living with just my mum and in my childhood home up in the mountains near a forest, which, full disclosure, I absolutely loved my home since I was a big fan of nature. One night, though, I woke up from an absolutely horrible nightmare and quickly made my way to my mum's room to wake her up because I was so panicked. After I stopped crying, I got into bed with her, and as we were falling asleep, I told her that I didn't want to live in that house anymore, and all my mum said was, "I promise this is the last night you have to sleep in this house." And that was a haunting promise that was kept. You see, we were woken up while it was still dark by my dog barking non-stop outside. My mum got out of bed grumbling about him being so loud that early and made her way to the front door that led to the front garden where my dog was yapping away. We had an alarm system on the doors and windows, so I just heard my mum deactivate it in order to check on what was going on with the dog. I was still laying in bed because I was cold and it was still too early to get out of bed. When suddenly I heard my mum scream, which caused me to stand up and call for her. Not even 30 seconds later, though, a man dressed fully in black and wearing a balaclava came into the room and told me to get dressed, and I quickly did as I was told. They took me to the living room where two men, dressed exactly the same as the one who got me, had my mum with a bandage over her eyes. I just remember her begging the three men to leave us alone and telling them where her wallet and valuables were, but one of them just said, "That's not why we're here." They proceeded to put a pillowcase over our heads and shoved us into the trunk of our car, and after this, the rest of the events were just a bit fuzzy since it was hard to tell time and our sight was so limited, I had no idea what was going on. But I do remember they hid us somewhere in the forest, hidden between a sort of rock wall and a bed mattress, I think. I can't really say how long we were there, and I have vague memories of one of the men's backs that I caught a glimpse of when I peeked under the pillowcase. All my mother did, though, was pray non-stop. One, because she truly believed in God, but two, because Mexicans are extremely religious and it might dissuade them from killing a mother and child. After being moved to another location, though, inside a seemingly abandoned house, they called my mum to ask for ransom. We couldn't really hear most of the conversation, but the man that we'd nicknamed the Mean One felt the need to tell me that my father didn't love me and that they were going to send him a few of my fingers if they didn't pay up. Shortly, we were loaded into another car where my mum started begging one of the men to not kill us. They drove around for what felt like hours until they suddenly stopped and dragged us out and told us to get on our knees. At this point, my mother was certain that we were going to get shot, so she asked that if they did, to shoot me first in order for me not to hear my own mother die. The men said nothing, and we then abruptly heard the car peel out, and my mother just screamed at me to run as fast as I could. We ran for a few minutes and then saw a residential area where we started frantically knocking on the doors, hoping that the kidnappers didn't plan on coming back for us. To our desperation, nobody in the first 2 houses opened up their door when suddenly an old man opened up at the 3rd house, and after trying to explain to him and seeing the state that we were in, he let us come in and call my father. After he picked up the phone, all I could do was cry after hearing his voice. He came to get us, and that night was the first and last time that I ever saw my father cry. So I work nights, and I often drive home alone around 2 or 3 in the morning. When the roads are pretty much completely deserted as well, that's when I'm usually coming home. Last night, I was driving home and got stopped at a light. There's a fairly large man crossing the street to my left with a guy in a wheelchair trailing behind him. They get to the curb and they start waving at me and step off the curb to cross where I'm stopped. At this point, my light was turned green, and the guy walking is waving his arms in the air at me. It's a 4-lane road, so I figure since he's with someone in a wheelchair that he's just wanting to make sure that I see them while they're trying to cross. So I do that acknowledgement wave and stay stopped so they can cross. Then the large guy suddenly starts drifting away from the crosswalk and seems to be walking towards my car. The guy in the wheelchair continues in the crosswalk, so I don't think much of it, until I notice that, no, it's not that this guy is just a little wobbly. He is definitely walking straight toward my door. My light is still green, so I decided that I'm just going to go before this guy gets to my door, and so I start driving, and as I'm maneuvering around this guy in the wheelchair, he gets up out of the wheelchair and starts jogging after my car. I floored it at that point, and looked in my rear view to see them both just standing there looking in the direction of the car. I don't know what their real plan was, but driving to work tonight made me nervous that they'll be out there again on my way home. A couple of years back, I was coming home from a gig in Cambridge, England, and I didn't have enough fuel to get home. So, of course, I pull into a petrol station. I'm pressing the pump, but getting no response from the shop and can't see an assistant, on the other side of the window that is. It's 2 a.m. at this point, so the shop isn't open. You have to pay through the hole in the window, etc., etc. And anyway, I'm standing there like a lemon and nothing's happening, so I approach the night window and bang on it. Still nothing. Nobody home. But just then I hear a shuffle behind me and a sort of deranged, breathy giggle. As I spin around, there he is. The strangest, most peculiar looking, I don't even know what, that I've ever seen. A wide-eyed, scruffy-hooded man on all fours, in a crawl position, head cocked up, glaring at me with a menacing, snarling, saliva-laced grin. I sort of back away slowly, just assessing the situation. Is he just a complete nutter that's escaped from an asylum or something? Or is he sinister? A hole that gets a thrill out of scaring people or something? As I back away, he slowly moves sideways whilst giggling and wheezing at the same time, all dribble around his mouth and chin. Our glares are locked on each other and I'm preparing to run up and boot him in the chops. And just then, the shop attendant appears from hiding under the counter and puts a sign against the window saying, "Police have been called." This is enough to get the lunatic's attention, and he slowly rises to a haunched standing position and just stares, still smiling at the window in makeshift sign. This gives me enough time to run and jump into my motor. I get in and I lock all the doors, but stick around as I just wouldn't forgive myself if the guy got hurt or something. The guy inside, that is. And even though the nut job was locked out, you never really know, right? The freak didn't move a muscle for what seemed like 3 minutes or so, but then sirens in the distance snapped him out of it quick smart. He lifts his head to shout and swear towards the sky, then runs off into the trees behind the petrol station. At this point, I've had enough and I exit for home. The adrenaline lasted hours, but I managed to drive okay and all was fine in the end. And I know that he was just a man in a hoodie acting like a total loon, probably high on something. But, man, that was one of the creepiest things that I've ever experienced. So we've been going to a local pool for 6+ weeks for swimming lessons. This was the last week, and as soon as I had my son, 16 months, dressed, an old, I would say 70-year-old plus maybe, lady walked in. She immediately, almost before turning the corner, said, "How old is he?" Now, I love showing off my baby boy, but she was immediately creeping me out. She was standing less than 1.5 feet from my face, and I couldn't back up as I was in a corner. She began asking, in a sort of monotone and low voice, all kinds of questions about him and how old he was. I answered vaguely and only gave as much info as I'd give any other stranger, his age and name. She then asked me again when he was born, and I said August. She then said, "I'm born in February, my mum in October, my dad in July, my brother in December." She listed another brother and some grandkids as well, but I was now frozen as those are the exact same birth months as my family, down to the family member. She continued to ask the same questions and tell me the same info over and over. At one point, looking at my son and then me, and says in a really dull and creepy voice, "I'm sorry," with a huge pause in between. "I just want to take him and go." I don't respond to this. At this point, I was starting to get my son's clothes wet because I'm in my bathing suit holding him freshly dressed, so I'm getting a little antsy and also freaked out. She looks at me and says in her monotone, slightly annoyed voice, "I'm bothering you, aren't I?" I start to say, "No, I just need to get dressed," and she cuts me off and begins to ask about my son's eye color. I start to say that they're blue, and she again cuts me off and asks what color mine are. I then again start to say blue, and she reaches to my face and uses her fingers to open up my eye, then agrees that they're blue and looks back at my son. She doesn't touch him, thankfully, but says, "They're blue, just be happy that they're not black," and gives a really monotone laugh. All in all, she made me extremely uncomfortable. My son wasn't in any danger, I think, and I'm the most passive person in the world. I wasn't really sure what to make of her at the time, so I remained as friendly as possible, but stopped adding anything to the conversation after she rattled off her family's birthdays that are the exact same as my family's. I really don't know what to make of any of this. Do you guys? This happened almost 25 years ago, way before cell phones were a thing. When I was 17, my brother, 13 at the time, and I were travelling in northern British Columbia in mid-November. This is important as the darkness at this time of year in the mountains is pretty much absolute. We were in the Pine Pass, and anyone who knows this area knows how desolate it is. I'm talking hundreds of kilometers between gas stations and any kind of people or buildings or anything. We were just about at the Powder King ski resort turn-off, and it was getting late. We pulled into a roadside turnout around maybe 10 or 10:30 because I was super tired. My brother was already sleeping, so I pull in and park near some tourist signage, lock my doors, and put my seat back up to sleep. I'm pretty much dead asleep when something just snapped me awake. To this day, I'm really not sure what it was that woke me up, but I was looking around trying to figure out what was happening when all of a sudden my car was surrounded by 4 or 5 men. They started yanking at the door handles trying to get in the car. I'm not sure if they saw that I was awake or not, but I quickly sat up and slammed the car in drive and peeled out of there quick smart. I'm not sure if I hit one of them or not, and to be honest, I didn't care to check. I didn't stop again until my auntie's house in Prince George. It was one of the most terrifying times of my life to be out there in the middle of nowhere, so exposed, and to be taken advantage of like that. So, it was 2016, and me, 22, and my husband, 28, were moving to a rental home. I was 6 months pregnant, and we were thrilled to move into a nice community since we had lived in a pretty sketchy part of town. We didn't know much about this rental except that it was in a good school district, low crime area, within our budget. Time passes without any problems, and soon our son is born. His birth was pretty much textbook, and he slept well in the hospital. But this all changed when we brought him home. The first night home was just absolutely awful. Every time we set him in his crib, he screamed. I'm not talking a normal "I'm hungry or need a new diaper" cry, a legitimate scream like he was in pain. My husband and I had to take shifts at night, so the one could be with him and the other could sleep. My shift was always second and started around 2 or 3 in the morning. I tried my best to sleep, but shortly after my son's birth, I began having these just horrible nightmares. I would dream nightly about my son being hurt or needing me, and I just couldn't get to him. At my 6-week checkup, I told my OBGYN, and she believed that I was having postpartum anxiety and even prescribed me medicine and recommended that I see a counselor. Weeks passed by since starting the medicine and counseling, and I was still having nightmares, and my son was still screaming all night long. His pediatrician told us that it was colic and that he just needed to wait it out. Everything changed, though, when he turned 3 months old. His screaming continued, but started to be all day instead of just at night. My nightmares became much more specific. One night, I dreamed that I walked into my son's room and he was on fire and screaming. Though I was in his room, my feet were stuck inside his doorway. I couldn't move or speak. I could only watch my son screaming in pain. I woke up from that dream, screaming and hyperventilating. My husband ran into our room and tried to console me. The next few days, I just couldn't sleep. I spent most of my days at work and my evenings sitting on my front porch talking to my next-door neighbor. She was a really sweet old lady who had lived in this neighborhood since it was originally built in the 70s. And I guess that she could tell something was wrong and asked if I was okay. Reluctantly, I told her how my baby had been acting and how I was having these horrible nightmares. She was sympathetic and asked me to elaborate. I didn't feel comfortable telling her the details, so I just told her that I had dreams about fires in the house. Her face quickly changed, though, from caring and concerned to horrified. Seconds of quiet felt like hours before she spoke again. Do you know what happened at this house?" she said. I told her no. She sighed and looked down before grabbing my hands and looking at me. She goes on to tell me that a few years ago there was a fire in the house due to some faulty wiring done poorly by the landlord or something. There was a young family with a 3-month-old baby living there, and unfortunately, the baby passed away in the fire. She said the couple moved away and the house was renovated and put up for rent after. And after hearing that, I was in complete shock. I ran inside to my husband holding our baby and told him that we needed to leave. He must have seen the fear in my eyes since he did not even ask me to explain myself until we had gotten into the car. I explained what happened in the house and how I felt like my dreams were warnings that we needed to leave before something happened to our kid. Luckily, my brother-in-law lived in the next town over, so we went there. And the first night we stayed in his house, our son slept all through the night. Not a single peep. In fact, I checked on him every hour since it was so unusual for him to sleep this well. From then on, apart from my normal baby stuff, my son never screamed again like he did in that house. My husband packed our stuff and we stayed with my brother-in-law until we were able to get our own lease somewhere else and rent a new place. I never went back. I never will go back. I just pray for whoever moved in there next that they're okay. So when I was young, I was super into the paranormal and would read as many true life accounts as I could. Nowadays, the X-Files and the odd horror film are as involved as I get, but I would still love to believe these things happen. I also really love science though, so I struggle to accept these things exist. That being said, this is definitely the craziest thing that has ever happened to me, and I've never had anything like it before or since. It might have just been a night terror, but anyway, here's what happened. A few years ago, I'd been ill for a couple of days. I literally never get sick, and it was a running joke at work that I'd never taken any sick days. I'd been feeling a bit groggy though, and I had a fever, so was finally off work for a day or two. Anyway, the night in question, I remember being woken up because my bed was going up and down like a seesaw. I was super disorientated about what was actually happening, but it also seemed like the bed was in the air for this to be happening. But quite aggressively, there was a definite seesaw motion. That I remember. There was also a kind of whooshing or a rushing sound, and the best way to describe it, that I can think of anyway, is the white noise equivalent of light, if that makes sense. It was basically a total sensory overload. I was lying on my back trying to figure out what was going on, and my left arm was at a 90-degree angle to my side, stuck rigid against the bed. I remember looking at it and thinking, oh no, I can't move. It was almost anchoring me to the bed as all this was going on. And suddenly, my back goes rigid and I slowly sit up to a seated position in a perfect sit-up motion. Except I can't do sit-ups like this. There's no way that I have the actual physical capability or core strength for that moment in the way that it just happened. At the same time, my head is tilted right back and my jaw is locked open in like a silent scream. I don't remember being scared because the whole thing was just really disorientating. I was pretty exhausted in general from being unwell, so fear seemed to require too much energy. But I remember the head tilt and the jaw lock and really stretching my physical capabilities in these moments. Then, as suddenly as it had began, it all goes silent and dark, the bed stops and I just flop back down. But just for a moment. Because then the bed and the noise and the light all start again, except this time both my arms are stuck to the bed, so I'm lying in a sort of cross position. I remember thinking very vividly that if I can get my arms free, the whole thing will stop. This was like the only moment of clarity in the entire experience, along with the less defined knowledge of something very bad causing this. I don't know what it was, of course, but all I could think was that, or maybe feel is the better word, is that this thing was very bad. There was also a less defined knowledge of a good force being around, and freeing my arms was what I had to do to win this battle, as it were. Eventually, I managed to yank my arms free of being stuck, and at that moment, everything stops. And then I have a very brief moment of being a bit worried or panicked before I literally pass out and I guess go back to sleep. Now, I've had dreams and nightmares lots of times, but I've never had anything like this happen before or since then. It was an entirely different experience, and I thought maybe a hallucination or my fever breaking, but it was just some next level crazy, that's for sure. I also don't know if a fever breaking or a hallucination can do something like this. I'm inclined to believe that it was just a hallucination or a hyper-realistic dream, but I wasn't that ill, and I've definitely been a lot sicker without the bizarre experience. Anyway, who knows what it was. Maybe it was just a night terror, though terror wasn't really a prominent feeling. Maybe it was a visit from an unfriendly something or other. Maybe it was aliens. I don't know, but I would like to hear what you guys think. So I was 15 when this happened. I was laying in bed watching TV. I had the house to myself as Mum had went to get groceries or something. But when the credits to the show that I was watching came on, I saw in the reflection of the black screen someone standing by my doorway. The moment that I saw this figure, I froze. I was completely paralyzed with fear to the point that my head started heating up. I felt like I was about to faint, to be honest, but somehow I racked up the nerve to turn my head and see if someone was actually there, and to my relief, there was nobody. I guess I must have just been seeing things. So I thought. I went back to watching TV when minutes later I received a text from my neighbor letting me know that Charlie, my dog, was out on the street. My neighbor is really old and has poor eyesight, so I assumed that he was mistaking Charlie for another dog. Nevertheless, I looked around to confirm that Charlie was indeed missing. After calling his name and receiving no response, I stood up and headed downstairs towards the living room, as Charlie likes to rest there, and on my way I noticed the front door was open. When I saw this, I instantly got chills. It was at this moment that I realized that the figure that I'd seen earlier wasn't just me seeing things. I immediately proceeded to walk out the door, but as I proceeded, the sound of footsteps running down the stairs could be heard from my position. I bolted out of there as fast as I could, and I ran straight to my neighbor's house. I told him what had happened, to which he responded by calling the police. The police came to my house, and they inspected the place. They couldn't find anyone, except for a switchblade that the intruder must have dropped as he bolted out of the house upon hearing the sirens of police cars about a mile away, I think. I think back to this day quite often, and I often think that if it wasn't for my neighbor's text, I'm sure that I would have made the headlines that evening. I'm a security guard for an alarm response company. We answer alarms for businesses and private residences. 99% of the time, it's just a motion detector set off by a cat, or a restaurant forgot to disarm their stuff before the stock truck arrived to unload. Just stuff like that. But in this case, I was called out to a house where the back door alarm was set off. Like, it thought that someone opened it. The owner was out of town, but she was alerted by her app and had her mother meet me there. We checked the door, and it's locked. We figured that maybe someone tried the door, but it didn't budge, setting off the alarm. But there's a light on inside. The mum mentions this to the daughter on the phone. The daughter says that she isn't sure if she left the light on or not. It's a good idea to make people think someone's home, but she just isn't sure. But that gave me a bad tingle. The mother wanted to go inside to check. However, she didn't have a spare key. The neighbor did, but they were asleep and Mum didn't want to wake them. So I fill out my papers and go back to my normal patrol route. But an hour later, the same home sends out an alert. I'm the only one in my city zone, so I answer it again. And when I pull up, police and CSI are there talking to the mother and the now awake neighbor. They're reviewing the video footage sent to them by the daughter. I look at the footage, and 4 armed men wearing masks and hoodies came out of the bathroom a minute after the mother and I left. They proceeded to rob the place. They had broken in and locked the door behind them for appearances, and they were the ones who turned on the light. The mother told me 3 guys had robbed her daughter's home about a month before this. Somehow they knew when this girl was going to be out of town. They appeared smart, desiring a quiet robbery without conflict. But they did bring guns, so they were prepared to shoot their way out of trouble if need be. Now, the mother had wanted to go in, and if she had had a key or woken the neighbor for the key, we would likely have been shot dead by these guys when we went inside. Work doesn't give me like Kevlar vests or anything like that too, so it's pretty much guaranteed a death sentence. If I ever get another house call and someone is in there, I am not going inside no matter what is asked of me. I count myself fortunate the way this place was blocked this time because I was prepared to foolishly go in and check if I could. I will say though that the 1% of calls where something is actually off, it's never been as bad as this one. I live in Finland, in a fairly small city, and this happened to me a year ago when I was 14. So, it was a Friday evening, and on every Friday our mum lets us go to the store and buy some candy. So me and my 12-year-old sister left our house to go to the store, and it was already dark outside. We made our way to the closest store, which was over a mile away. While walking at some point, there's a man behind us walking the same way, but I didn't think much about it at the time. He could just be going to the same store after all. So I continue chatting with my sister while the man is behind us, following us at a safe distance. We get to the store with no complications, and the man followed us into the store. We take our time selecting our candy and get to the register to pay. While I was packing the candy into my backpack, I saw this man buying only a chocolate bar. It was a pretty far way to go for a chocolate bar, I thought, and at this point, my suspicions start to rise about this guy. I leave the store with my sister, and we start making our way back. We walked for a while, and I quickly glanced at my back, and the man was still there following us. I took a look at my sister, who seemed totally unaware about the man's presence. We continued our walk, and up ahead of us was an unlit dirt road that continued for a good part of the trip, so I look at my back again, and there the man still was about 60 feet away. At this point, I was almost certain that he was following us because on our way to the store, he didn't walk this part of the way behind us. The dirt road goes through a forest, and it had a curve at the start of it. And once we got to the curve, I look back and notice that the man can't see us, so I quickly pull my sister to the woods and we duck down in there. My sister is saying something, and I just whisper, "Stay quiet," to her as I wait for the man to come by. I could see the man's shadow sort of coming down the road, and he started looking for us from the road. He walked back and forth on this road a few times, and now I was certain that he was following us all that time. My heart was racing like you wouldn't believe, and I tried to be as quiet as possible. Thankfully, the man didn't find us, but continued running forwards. We stayed in the forest for quite some time before getting the courage to come out again. We walked the rest of the way home with no problems, and we get to our house. We eat our candy and have a good evening, but that really did bother me for a while, and especially my sister too. Thinking back on this still gives me chills, and the thought of getting caught in that situation, in the middle of the woods with no one around, it really creeps me out, and I try not to think about it too much. I know for a fact that that guy was up to something no good, and I'm just glad that I had the intuition to step into those woods when I did. So, it was the summer of 2004. I was 15 at the time and working weekends at a skate park, running the registers and keeping up shop. I was the only female employee there. The reason that I got the job, I thought at the time, was because I used to hang out there a lot prior to being offered a position. Now, they used to host events and sort of rock shows a ton. Those were extremely fun and the place where all my friends gathered for a good time, so we got to know the owners pretty well. The two guys that owned the shop were in their 40s, overweight, balding, typical older white guys, but they were extremely nice. Their names were Doug and Mark. Doug was always more serious about the business, always trying to come up with ideas to better it and rarely joking around. He was also married with kids. Mark, on the other hand, seemed like Doug's minion, I suppose. What I mean is that he was usually out running errands, making calls, or cleaning the shop. He was a single guy, he was very outgoing and silly, so we always had fun with him around until, well, one day when the fun just stopped. Before I tell you about the scariest moment of my life, I think, I'll inform you of the events, or I'd like to call them red flags leading up to it. So, on one occasion, we were hosting a show where a local metal band was playing. There were lots of people there, kids and adults alike. They were skating and running up and down the ramps and the bowls and stuff, just generally having a good time. Then Mark suddenly came up behind me as I was talking with my friend Katie, and he all of a sudden just picked me up and swung me over his shoulder and started tickling and spinning me around, right in the middle of this crowd. I laughed it off and was yelling for him to stop in a sort of giggly way, but I was honestly a bit creeped out by that, as he had never touched me before, even in a friendly way. Even at 15, I found this pretty inappropriate for a man in his 40s to be so touchy on me like that. But after about a minute, he put me down and was laughing and apologizing. To be honest, I didn't think much of it because, like I said, it was in a crowd, and thought maybe I was just overreacting a bit. A week or two go by, and I noticed Mark was giving me sort of flirty looks and sticking his tongue out at me when he was around. Again, I didn't think too much about it, as he was a nice guy. I thought that he was just being funny. But one day, though, Mark called me into the back. We had 2 doors right behind the register that led into our stockroom, as Doug sat at the register on a business call. When we got to the back room, he picks me up, sets me on the washing machine and tells me that he wants to kiss me. I automatically shut him down, obviously, but he then tries to persuade to lift up my shirt. At this point, I'm really freaked out, and I'm just hoping Doug comes through those doors any second. Again, I firmly tell him no, as I hop down and proceed to walk to the front of the shop. That's when Doug opens the door and asks, "Hey, what are you guys doing? Did Mark show you our butterfly collection?" I just responded with, no, and I walk out. They both follow me. The rest of the day was pretty uneventful, and I just wanted it to end. Now, I usually got off work at around 6 or 7, but around 5, Doug asks me to go to Mark to run some errands. He jokingly said, "Take my credit card, but don't give it to Mark." All I could think about was how awkward this ride was going to be, as we hadn't talked since the incident earlier that day. I was really dreading this trip, to be honest, but I had no idea what was about to unfold. So we get in the car, drive to my high school, which is on the other side of town, in a medium-sized sort of busy city, but about 5 minutes away from my house. And as we pull in the back parking lot on a Saturday, I ask him what we were doing here. He responds by saying, "I'm scouting out an area for a skate park. It's behind the school here." And this is when I start to get nervous, but hoping it's true, because I did know that they were trying to expand locations at that time. He gets out of the car and motions for me to get out and come along. I hesitantly do so. We start walking to the back of the school, and he's just talking about his visions of the new park and stuff. Nothing too serious. That's when we approach the woods, though. Not a wooded area, too, like straight up dense forest-like woods. Ones you could barely walk through, in fact. And that's when he says, "Take my hand, come on, I'll show you the spot." And this is when the alarms went off in my head, and I realized that I could be in real danger if I go with this creep. In my head, I'm contemplating whether I should run or just go along with him, because I didn't know which one was about to make my situation worse at the time. This pondering seemed like it went on forever, when in reality it was probably only a few seconds. But thank God that I paused a second before making any decisions, because that was when my cell phone rang. I honestly forgot I even had it on me. It was my mum asking me if she could pick me up early so we could go to dinner. That's when I tell her with a sense of urgency, "Yes, I'm at the high school, come and get me, now." I think she could hear the fear in my voice too, and left immediately because she was there in less than 5 minutes. During those 5 minutes, I tell Mark that I have to go and wait on my mum. He seemed agitated by that, but agreed and walked me to the front steps of the school to wait. He didn't say bye or anything. He just suddenly, sort of briskly walked away to his car. My mum shows up a couple of minutes later. I hop in quicker than I've ever done anything in my life, and I know that I must have been shaking. I tell her that I'm not in the mood to eat and just drop me off at home. She asks me if I'm okay, and I said yes, and that me and a co-worker were just there scouting for a new spot. I get dropped off at home eventually, and I think I'm just in shock and full of fear. What I did next was I quit working there that very day. I just never went back. I didn't explain anything to anyone, and I've only told my boyfriend and a couple of friends about this. But I'm 100% convinced, looking back on all of the red flags and the fact that Doug didn't seem to trust Mark. Doug actually seemed like a good guy, that if I had went into those woods, I wouldn't be here today. Who knows what he would have done to me as well. It's weird when you survive something like this. It's never really seemed real to me, I suppose, but it very much was. These days, I actually have a 12-year-old daughter myself, and I try to teach her about safety and predators all the time. This kind of experience, it changes you, and it changes the parent that you become too, I think. An update to this, though, was that about 2 years later, Mark called my house phone. I don't know how he got my number too, and told me that he was in Istanbul, Turkey, and about to open a skate shop there. I just said, please don't call me anymore, and I hung up. Luckily, my nightmare was over after that, but hearing from him was honestly like talking to the devil or something. In any case, I hope that guy is in jail so that he can't hurt anyone else. I've always wondered if Doug ever found out about Mark, and if maybe Mark had to flee the country for a crime that he committed, landing him in Istanbul or something, because going there in the first place seemed weird. Anyway, this turned out a bit longer than intended, but the point is, as a woman or a girl, especially, never trust anyone who's been a creep to you. In fact, I don't really trust much of anyone anymore. To tell you the truth, I really don't remember exactly how old I was when it happened. Probably 6 or 7, I think. I know that the war that was raging in my homeland had finally come to an end because my father had finally returned home, which had brought a smile back to my mum's face. They were finally able to visit relatives at the other end of the state, those that survived, that is. And while they were away for the week, my grandmother looked after me. So that night, I was lying on my mattress in my little room trying to fall asleep, and just as I was drifting off to sleep, Maximilian, a dog that we had, started barking loudly. In a split second, the door to the room opened and then closed, and all of a sudden I couldn't move my body at all. In fact, an unknown face could be seen through the outlines of the darkness. That figure, which now also had a body, sat on my chest and began to choke me. I couldn't breathe. Blood gushed from its eyes as it repeated over and over again, "I don't want to see, I don't want to see." It was a woman's voice. Filled with just horror, I somehow managed to pull myself out of her bloody grip and rushed toward the light switch. I quickly turned it on, and when I did, there was no one in the room but me. I am drenched in cold sweat. I want to scream, but no sound is coming out. That's when I noticed that there was black smoke suddenly coming out of thin air, and it begins to fill the room. No matter how hard I try, I can't open the door too. The smoke takes on what looks like the form of faces or something, but the light is on. How is this possible? After looking at these faces for some time, eventually I just lose consciousness, I think. I wake up, curled up on the floor. I feel drained and really scared. Well, I just can't really explain it. Was it sleep paralysis? I don't know, but I'm convinced that I was wide awake when I turned the light on. Maybe I was losing my mind for a moment or something. I don't know, but let me tell you that when I think about it, it definitely messed me up for some time afterwards. This is an experience that I've kept hidden for years because I know how crazy it sounds. I've dealt with this particular experience for a majority of my life, mostly in dreams, but it began in real life in front of my own two eyes. And while I am an avid believer of the supernatural, or other beings that aren't on this plane of existence, I have a hard time believing myself on this one. I'm sure that that's normal though, right? Anyways, I'll go back to the night that it began. I was in 4th or 5th grade and I went into bed for the night. A quick description on the layout of the room at the time too. My twin bed was on the right corner with 2 windows on the opposite wall, one directly parallel to my bed. So, as I crawled into bed and got comfy, I looked across my room and through my window, which was covered by purple sheer curtains, and I saw the shadow of a man looking through my window at me. This shouldn't be possible though, as my room was on the 2nd floor. While looking at the shadow, I kept trying to find its flaw that revealed the fact that it was fake, but I just couldn't find it. I kinda just stared at it, trying to make any sense of it, and eventually I just dozed off and made it my mission to look outside my window the following morning at the bus stop to see if any objects could possibly create a shadow like that. I got outside of my bus stop the next morning, but there was nothing there that could have created it. And every night for years, I had the same nightmare where I would go into my room, the curtains are open, and he yells at me and kills me. And that was usually right when I would wake up. Years went by, and I eventually stopped having them, thankfully. However, the summer after I graduated high school, they returned. Way more complex this time, too. Every time I would have this dream, he gets closer and closer to me. He's always waiting for me in the shadows, or he's chasing me. I had sleep paralysis in college, and I had a similar feeling during that I have during these nightmares with this shadow. And I guess that I'm just trying to see if any of you guys have any ideas on what this could be. Why am I seeing it? Why am I so scared of it? Is there anything that I could do to stop the fear and the nightmares? Also, it's probably a good thing to mention that I haven't seen this figure with my own two eyes since the first night, years and years ago. I'm 21 now. I've thought about the possibility of it being a shadow person, but for some reason it just doesn't seem right. The shadow was very clear and had a precise figure, unlike the stuff that I've read up on shadow people. However, I will happily admit that I'm just not that educated on the matter, and so I just try not to think about it too much. This happened around 2001 when I was 21 or so. I was a college student living at home. My house was on a quiet downtown street in a college town. I'm not a sleepwalker per se, but sometimes when I'm really tired, it takes me a few minutes to really wake up. Within those first few minutes, I'll often go about my business, almost by habit I think. I've gone to the bathroom, brushed my teeth, etc. before fully awakening. And one afternoon, I was home alone and taking a nap on the living room couch. My doorbell rang. It felt like a part of my dream almost, and the next thing I knew, I was standing in front of the vestibule, a little room between my porch and the front door, talking to a strange young man. I have no memory of getting up and answering the door, to be honest. But he was young, late teens or early 20s, clean-cut and dressed normally. Nothing stood out about him. He was holding a sort of stack of something. He was in the process of explaining to me that he was part of some rehab program that took minority, low-key offenders from troubled backgrounds and helped rehab them by teaching them life skills. He and others were out that day selling magazine subscriptions for their non-profit. At first I told him that I wasn't interested, but He was really friendly and wouldn't back down. He was polite, but definitely pushy. I finally told him that I would look. While thumbing through the catalogue, though, I became aware of him moving closer and closer to me. All the hair stood up on my neck. He was really crowding me and invading my personal space. I didn't want to be rude. I know. But I just shuffled backwards towards my door until the knob was pressed into my back. But what made me really uncomfortable, though, was what he was saying to me. He kept going on about, this is a really nice house. How can I get me a nice house like this? Finally, to get him to leave, I wrote him a check for a subscription service, but just as I was starting to close the door on him, he put his hand in and asked for a glass of water. And it was at that all my antennas went straight up. I knew not to let him into my house, but he'd moved forward to where we were almost touching. His hand was on my doorframe, blocking me from leaving the vestibule. I could only move backwards, and when he asked a second time, I said, sure. And then before he could react, I said, be right back. As I quickly backed in, shut the door in his face, and set the deadbolt. Watching him from a window, I actually heard him curse, ball up my check, and then walk away. He got into a dark sedan that was parked maybe a half a block down my street and driven by another young guy, I think. And despite how he was supposedly going from door to door, none of my other neighbors were approached. Also, my check was never actually cashed, and I never got my Cosmo. To be honest, I was actually a bit afraid that I may have totally overreacted, but at the time I just didn't feel comfortable at all. My upbringing, I suppose, was totally fighting my instincts. But since then, I've learned enough to know that I might have been really lucky that night. This happened back in the summer of 2015 when I was serving in the United States Army Reserves. I was stationed in southern Alabama in a transportation company. Sometimes, my girlfriend would come with me on drill weekends, and we would crash at a friend of hers apartment, which is where this incident took place. So, this particular weekend, we were in a large convoy in the middle of nowhere, on some back road out in the sticks, well over 100 miles from the city. And that was when I got the most just confusing, bizarre, and downright creepy phone call of my young life. She was in utter hysterics. She was crying and screaming, wondering why I would frighten her so badly. She was asking me what my problem was and how I even pulled it off. After I was finally able to calm her down, this is the story that she relayed to me. Sometime that afternoon, her friend was at work and she was at the apartment by herself. Suddenly, there was a loud bang at the door, not a knock, several loud, violent bangs, she said. After looking through the peephole, she saw me, but there was something off. She says that I was wearing my army uniform. It looked like me, but it had this very angry or aggravated look on my face. She opened the door, wondered why I was home so early, and apparently without saying a word, I just angrily blew past her, shoulder checking her into the wall, and quickly walked down the hall, taking a left into the bedroom, slamming the door behind me so hard that the whole place shook. She was obviously very alarmed and confused about why I was home so early and in such an agitated state. I mean, that was really out of character for me. I am not a violent guy at all, and on top of that, if something did happen to set me off, she would have been the first to hear about it. So she's walking behind me, trying to get some information out of me, and she opens the bedroom door behind me and sees the closet door slammed shut. She proceeds to run over to see what I was doing in her friend's closet, and claims that when she opened the door, it was completely empty. That was when she had a panic attack and called me. Now, imagine my shock and confusion hearing that story, knowing that I was well over 100 miles away at the time. She finally believed me after I sent her a photo with my current GPS location, which only served to freak her out even more. To be honest, though, I thought that there must be some kind of rational explanation for what she saw. I will be honest, though, and say that she did smoke a little weed here and there, but at the time, I know that she was sober. She didn't mess around with hard drugs or anything, or drink, and she had no mental illness of any kind. And over the years since that happened, I have come to learn about a phenomenon called doppelgangers. I don't know what they mean, or what they represent, or why they come around. All I know is that it's really creepy. And a girl that I dated for several years came face to face with mine, and it put the fear of God into the poor girl. Take from this story what you will, and honestly, I don't really care if anyone believes me or not. I just have to get it off my chest because it's bugging me. Thanks for listening, though, even if I'm not a great storyteller. So I was hiking the CDT in Colorado about maybe a day north of Dillon, Silverthorne, and was crossing a deep little creek that was giving me trouble. Another guy caught up to me and found a better crossing a little off the trail, so I used it, talked to the guy for a bit, and walked another mile or so and set up my camp. The other guy did too, though. In the morning, I left early and hiked up a steep slope and along a ridge where the other guy caught up to me and stuck with me like glue. He started talking about hiking the rest of the trail together, but I didn't want to, and I said that I had stuff to do off the trail at various places further along. But this guy, he just didn't get it, and started saying that we could save money buying food together and planning meals and stuff. I said that I was fine how I was and was a picky eater anyway. I started changing my pace, going faster and slower, but whenever I did, I just couldn't get rid of this guy. Now, there's a brutal road walk past Pettingill Peak that climbs up a pass toward a mountain, and I bolted up there, but the guy was killing himself trying to keep up and started telling me that I was being mean and should wait for him so we could hike together. I wanted nothing to do with this guy, though, and I just kept going. But as I was hiking around the peak, I stopped for a few seconds to grab some food, and yep, he caught up again. He started saying that I was lucky that he caught up in time for us to set up camp together, and started saying that it would make more sense if we just set up one tent and shared it, so there's less work and it would be warmer. I have a one-person lightweight, tiny tent, mind you. So I just grabbed my pack and I left, went back around and straight down the mountainside to a forestry road with this guy following me again. It got dark and hard to see, but I was on the forestry road by then and heading into Winter Park. A few miles before town, there was a forest fire and some forestry crews working on it. They were all back at their camp just off the road, so I went to them and asked if I could put up my tent just behind them in a clearing. A few minutes later, I saw the other guy go past. I was jumpy and a little bit scared after that and got off the trail in Grand Lake for a few days, went to Denver and bummed around, got back on the trail and was a little bit paranoid at first, but didn't see the guy again, and when I asked other hikers if they'd seen him, nobody recognized the description. I'm 6'2" and 200 pounds, but man, I'll take wild animals over that guy any day. So, I was out doing some late night fishing in a small but deep hole on the side of the state road near my house. Every time that I fish there at night by myself, I worry about what would happen or what I would do if someone were to pull over next to me, but it's never really happened. Until now, that is. So, quick detour for the second story. I wasn't always like this. I used to fish by myself in the middle of the night, all the time and without a care in the world. But there was one night about maybe 10 years ago now, which perhaps merits its own post, but I'll slide it in here and include it in this story anyways, where I was fishing off a seawall next to a bridge and a car pulls over next to me. Two young men, but older than I was at the time, got out. They walked up to me casually and asked me if I was catching anything. I told them no, not really. I wasn't really suspicious of them or anything. I thought that they were going fishing and just thought that they would ask if I was having any luck or not before pulling their gear out. Now, The bridge was a popular fishing spot. I was sitting on the cement seawall with my feet dangling over the edge. One of the men, though, suddenly shoves me off the seawall into the water. They both grab my fishing gear and take off in their car. The fall was only about 7 feet or so, a complete guess, but it was enough that I couldn't lift myself out of the water and up the cement wall. I had to swim around to where the water was more shallow so that I could climb up the wall. My mum had dropped me off that night, and I was supposed to call her to pick me up later in the night, but my cell phone had gotten wet and would no longer work. To make matters worse, I was a smoker at the time, going on 2 years without smoking or any other form of nicotine, which is good, I suppose. But my cigarettes had also gotten wet, and as you can imagine, I really needed a cigarette. I didn't know what to do except to just, sit there until eventually my mum drove up randomly. She was furious too, until I explained what happened. But I shudder when I think about how I, or anybody else that they did this to, could have actually died. These people had no idea whether or not I knew how to swim. I was, or am, a very strong swimmer, thankfully, but apparently they just didn't care. If they had seen on the news the next day that I had drowned under the bridge, they put 2 and 2 together? Would they even care? Even if you assume everybody is a strong swimmer, the person could hit their head. There were a lot of rocks under the seawall, and be unconscious pretty quickly. And for what? $50 of cheap fishing gear? Anyways, clearly, ever since this night, 10-ish years ago, I've been much more cautious when I'm alone at night, but especially when I'm fishing alone at night. So, back to what actually happened tonight, which triggered me to write this post. So I had, luckily, just finished up and loaded my car back up with all my gear. I was actually sitting in my car and making an Instagram post showing the fish that I caught, a couple of yellow bullhead catfish and some bluegill. I was trying to quickly write the post and then head home, so I was deep into the world of my phone, not really paying attention to anything else. Something causes me to look up though, and out of my driver's side window, there's this pickup truck sitting there that I did not ever see pull up. It has one of those big steel frame structures around the bed of the truck. I don't know what they're called, but I associate them with hunters or trappers. Mind you, I have no idea whatsoever if that's an accurate association or not. I do feel like I have seen them though, or something similar, holding kennels with hunting dogs, so maybe that's where I got the idea from. In any case, there is this very stereotypical chubby redneck mullet type guy looking into my window at me, smiling a creepy smile. He was the passenger. I didn't or couldn't really look past him to the driver. I have no idea how long they were sitting there, but I very quickly debate winding down my window and asking what they wanted, but settled on putting my car into drive, driving around their truck and down the street. I was so freaked out that I didn't immediately go home, in fact. I went somewhere else and pulled over, looked around to see if they were anywhere to be seen, and then I actually went back to the fishing spot to see if they were still sitting there or not. I didn't pull over, mind you. I just drove by, but they were not there. It will drive me crazy wondering why they pulled over. Did they have something bad planned? Were they just curious, wanted to help? Will I have to worry about seeing them around town after driving off on them like that? I realized that my reaction was not completely fair. They could have been just pulling over to fish, although you've got to realize how small this fishing hole is. It's a literal fishing hole on the side of the road. It's probably about the size of a dining room or something. They could have been pulling over to see if I needed help or something. Who knows? All I know is that I was thinking that if I wind down the window to find out what they want, I could end up with a gun in my face for all I know, and then I would not get a chance to just drive off. So I drove off without acknowledging them in any way so that I didn't miss my chance. Even now, I worry about the fact that my car has some slightly identifying marks. Nothing crazy noticeable, but just small stickers in the window. and that I ticked them off by driving off like that or something, and they live around here. What if my wife meets up with them at some point? What if she has my daughter with her? Am I just being paranoid? I don't know. I'm still a little freaked out by the whole experience because it was weird, to say the least. So my boyfriend and I were backpacking in Yosemite last week. We were trying to make it to Little Yosemite Valley after having to turn back on our original trial due to ice. We didn't get to Little Yosemite due to our late start and had to illegally camp above Vernal Falls. But here's where it gets weird. Full disclosure too, I had taken an edible weed gummy before bed. I usually take 1.5, but only took one and don't really think this is the reason for what happened, but who knows, maybe. Anyway, shortly after falling asleep, I felt this weird sensation like an electric zap on one temple. I felt it move through my brain and out the other temple, and it jolted me awake so suddenly and harshly that I was sort of taken aback. I know it sounds crazy, but I was freaked, wrote it off as a really strange dream, I think, and just started to fall back to sleep. As I laid down, I noticed I had a slight feeling of pressure in the back of my eyes. Shortly after I fell back asleep, I was once again abruptly awoken by an electric zap type feeling, this time on the back of my thighs. As I was waking, my legs twitched like you would imagine with some sort of an electric surge, and I had a tingling feeling in my thighs. At this point, I was really weirded out and stayed awake staring at the ceiling of the tent, trying so hard to make sense of it. As I laid there, my body was slightly twitching, starting at my ankle, then my leg, then my shoulder, all on the right side. I remember having the thought that it feels like I'm a robot that's being worked on, and my mind wandered to the idea of what if I'm actually in a pod or a lab somewhere and the world is all a simulation. That thought may have been the gummy for sure. But I thought about waking my boyfriend, but worried that I would sound crazy, so I hesitantly let myself just fall back asleep, hoping that it wouldn't happen again. But I was shortly awoken by another zap in my lower abdomen that felt like it caused a sort of contraction. At this point, I was so scared and certain that I wasn't dreaming or imagining it, and immediately woke up my boyfriend, terrified, saying that I keep feeling like I'm being electrocuted. I told him everything, and he pet my head, told me that it was okay, and as he later told me, spent some time praying. Neither of us are religious or anything, so it was a bit weird, but he's a lot more spiritual than I am, I think. At this time, I also noticed a weird feeling in my abdomen that hadn't been there before this last shock. I eventually had to pee, but was too scared to leave the tent alone, so I asked him to walk out with me. And when I got out there, you guys, I could honestly barely walk. I was stumbling around and falling over as if I was just off my face, but we hadn't even had a sip of alcohol that day or night or anything. I'm also an experienced backpacker, so I don't think it would have been overworked muscles or anything. And a gummy has never had any impact on my ability to walk like that. In any case, I stumbled my way to a rock to lean on and fell once or twice before managing to prop myself up to pee, then got back in the tent without much issue. Thankfully, nothing really weird happened after that, but the difficulty walking really made me feel like something strange had happened that night. Funnily enough too, I felt completely normal and fine the next day, apart from being thoroughly weirded out, of course. Let me start by saying that I'm a 14-year-old male student from England. This happened to me back in September of 2020. And now, I had been decently acquainted with a girl called Olivia since the end of primary school. She was not a good-looking girl by any means. At the time that this happened, she was actually pretty, overweight. This will come into play later too. Around 5'5", and she had a really horrible sense of humor as well. Basically, she was the complete opposite of me. One day, though, on the first week back after the UK's first lockdown, she started following me on Instagram. Of course, I didn't find it any more than normal at the time, but That was the start of a really strange, creepy ordeal. She would send me DMs most days, asking how I was, what I was doing, that sort of thing. It went on like this for around 10 days, and I didn't find this too creepy at the time. I had no idea how much worse it would get. After a while, she would constantly DM me, at least 10 times every few hours, each one stranger than the next as well. She would start by saying how cool I was, which struck me as weird, as I was pretty much the definition of a nerd and still am today, and how I was perfect. She would constantly remind me that she dreams about me every night, and she wants to run away with me. That was when something finally clicked in my brain, and I realized just how strange this was getting, and I blocked her. And for a few days, that actually worked, before she made a new account. At first, it was the same as last time. Just the same odd messages about her loving me, but then it changed. It changed to her going on rants about how nobody liked her. Gee, I wonder why as well. And how she was going crazy without me. The weirdest one, though, was when she messaged me talking about how she was stress-eating everything that she could find because she was going crazy over love. This was getting too much now, and I told my parents, who told me to put my Instagram account on private and tell them if anything else happened. Strangely enough, it worked. She had completely stopped everything. The creepy DMs, the new accounts, everything. So, fast forward a month or so, to the middle of the night, I was going up the hill that I live on to the supermarket to get some things for Halloween and stuff when I saw a girl around my age crossing the street towards me. I looked at her for 1 second before realizing that through the hood over her head, it was Olivia. You see, I had been homeschooled by a private tutor for the last month to avoid her, so I was surprised that I saw her, but I did. Instincts kicked in immediately, and I'm running up the hill. I heard Olivia mumble something under her breath before attempting to run after me. I might have been a nerd, but I was kind of in good shape at the time, so I was able to get to the supermarket at least 30 seconds before her. I immediately went to an employee who thankfully stepped in before she got there. She was extremely out of breath from running up the hill maybe 50 meters. The employee grabbed her and went to a phone. He called the police and told them my story, also mentioning a knife in her pocket, which I didn't see at the time. During this time, she was just staring straight at me too. I could clearly see now that there was something wrong with her. She had clearly stuck to her word of eating everything that she could find, as I could see that she had gained at least another 20 kilos, I think. Her hair was longer and messier. Her clothes were just so tiny that you could see the bottom of her belly sticking out of the bottom of her hoodie, and she had a really sort of crazed, deranged look about her. When the police came to take her away, she stared me straight in the face and said one of the most haunting things of my life. She said, "Just so you know, I never loved you. You're lucky I'm so overweight, because if I wasn't, I would have caught you and slit your throat." Thank God that was the last time that I ever saw her. I started going back to school and my life slowly went back to normal. But obviously, that's not something that you forget easily. I guess if there's anything to learn from this story, then it's to never judge a book by their cover, because you never know if they're just a crazed psycho like that girl. I live in Georgia, in a rural town not so far from a major city. There's a set of woods that's behind our house, and it divides into two neighborhoods, and it's about a mile wide, if that. Strange occurrences have always surrounded these woods. Small things like random trash, tarps, etc. I should mention, too, that it's more swampy marsh than woods, so it makes camping in there pretty much impossible. One night, I was taking our dog out. He stays in the back half of the house due to him not liking the other dogs. I took him out the side door and walked around the house to the fence. And for some reason, when we left the house, he was absolutely terrified. He didn't want to go out. which was very unusual for a dog who's quick to snatch someone's soul if prompted. Just thinking that he was acting a bit weird, we pushed onward. After he tinkled, we walked back, and this is when I noticed it, or perhaps rather heard it, I think. Crunching of leaves. At first, I thought that it was one of our dozen cats on the property, until I realized that it was matching my steps. Like, if I walked, you could hear it walking. If I stopped, it stopped too. There's a small clearing between the woods where one of the sheds is too, and that's when we saw it. My dog was the first to see something, and then I saw I don't really know how to explain it, but creature. It was taller than the shed, so maybe a good 8 feet tall, and it darted across the clearing at a crazy fast speed. My dog, who again isn't scared of anything, bolted so fast that I dropped his leash and he ran to the door whining. I was quickly behind him too, and once we were inside, I quickly bolted the door and ran to tell my girlfriend what happened. She immediately wanted to investigate, saying that it's probably a woodland creature. Armed with 2 flashlights, we went out the front door, and as we walked towards the woodline, we could hear something moving around. It sounded maybe 200 yards away if I had to guess, but as we scanned with our flashlights, we saw nothing, but kept hearing it. Then we heard it get closer and closer, until it was maybe 20 feet away, I would guess. Still nothing though. No eyes, not even an animal call, just rustling. My girlfriend, now scared, heads for the house, and I decided to check with the neighbors to see if maybe one of their many dogs got out. When I arrived at his house, my neighbor, who his name is Dave, explained that all his dogs were accounted for. Curious though, he came to investigate with me. And this is when I noticed that whatever this thing was followed me along the woodline to Dave's house and was now behind Dave's house. Gun in hand now, we went into his backyard scanning for, well, anything really. We could hear it rustling or maybe running, but we still couldn't see anything. About 100 yards away now in thick, swampy woods, way too thick for a person to walk in, let alone run in. But then, all of a sudden, it just stopped. It was dead silent now, and scanning on the edge of where we were, we see nothing. And then, all of a sudden, it was 5 feet in front of us, sprinting at me. It slammed the fence so hard that it rocked it back and forth. Dave, now terrified, shot randomly at, well, nothing, because, truthfully, we never saw it. Again, as I mentioned, the woods are thick, too thick to run in, so what the heck teleported silently in front of us and slammed the gate like that? Spooked now, we were about to run, but then we heard it again. And this time it sounded like it was talking maybe. It was sort of human in nature, but not English. It sounded, I don't know, I don't want to sound crazy, but alien-like? Not a language that I recognize, that's for sure, but then again, I don't know many languages. And Dave, he heard it too. He's a hunter for like the last 40 years, and still to this day, he can't explain what that was. Anyway, after we heard that, that was enough, and we bolted. He covered me, and I ran to my house. Not 10 minutes later, we both heard a loud explosion coming from the woods. It shook our houses and flickered our power, in fact, and I ran outside to see what it was, and of course there was nothing again. But when Dave came out and confirmed that he felt the same thing, we were both once again terrified because it meant that we weren't imagining this. Moments later, a few strangers from the neighborhood came driving down to our cul-de-sac, and they all agreed the blast sound that they heard came from behind our house. 911 was called, and the 2 police officers interviewed us separately. Our stories matched, and the responding officers refused to go anywhere near those woods. Probably because they're marshland, like I said. They took the report, though, and they left, and to this day, we're still not sure what the encounter was. Also, these days, Dave just doesn't go outside at night anymore because it spooked him that bad. I'm sorry if this is a poorly told story. I'm not the best at it, but I can assure you that everything that I've just told you is true. This happened after I went to university, so I was 18. I made an effort to make friends after I moved onto campus and ended up with a few groups to hang out with, including a new girlfriend and plenty of people from my classes that I liked well enough. There was one class before lunch where it was traditional for people to go to the cafeteria afterwards to eat in pairs or threes. I wasn't very discerning about who I'd have lunch with because I got on fine with most people from the class and we were all trying to make an effort to be social. So when one girl, Lily, asked if I wanted to eat lunch together after that class, I didn't have any reason not to go. We talked about school and that kind of thing. Nothing noteworthy, but she did ask me to get lunch with her again the next week. It became a pattern, and there wasn't exactly a way to start saying no suddenly. It was fine though, but it did mean that I lost the chance to eat lunch with anyone else on those days. In hindsight, I suppose that was probably the point. Now, one day in class, I asked someone if I could add them on social media. This happened in front of Lily, and I saw her face jerk towards me from a couple of seats over. It was a sharp reaction that it was hard to ignore, and I still remember it. By the time that I got home later that day, Lily had sent me a friend request. No friends in common. I don't know how she even knew my last name. I was a bit surprised, to be honest, but I guess that she just dug through the university social media pages and found me through there or something. It definitely gave me a bad feeling, but surely it was fine, right? She ended up messaging me a lot and commenting on anything that I posted, in fact. I told myself that she was just awkward and we became friends, if not close. I mean, I'd known worse people for sure. She still always got me to go and eat lunch with her after our one shared class. Other than that, though, we rarely spent time together in person. Sure, I saw her around sometimes, but I never went out on my way to hang out with her or anything. So it was mostly online messaging and seeing each other in group settings. Coincidentally, my girlfriend was also called Lily. This was something that clearly bothered Lily as well, and not my girlfriend, who couldn't have found it less interesting. It was just a common name at the time. She occasionally hinted that she wanted my girlfriend to pick a different name or joked about her not suiting it. She clearly didn't like my girlfriend at all, and I had no idea why. It was getting hard to ignore by this point too, but Lily was starting to unsubtly hint that she had a crush on me. I tried not to address it because, what was I going to say? I've never really known what to do when a friend makes a pass at me, to be honest. I was also not interested in the least, and even ignoring the weird stuff that she pulled, Lily was just not my type at all. She tended to dress and act in a way somewhere between like a 50s housewife and one of those adults who's still obsessed with Disney princesses, if you can picture that. But things took an uncomfortable turn on the day of our last shared class of that year. Instead of asking me to lunch like she always did, Lily asked if I'd go for a walk with her. Again, I didn't exactly know how to refuse, so I said all right. Our campus was bordered by a large part of woodland, and Lily led me into the woods, and the sounds of our fellow students slowly faded away. She sat down on a log, and I joined her. She started talking about how she was going to miss me over the summer. I tried placating her, but I didn't want to be there, especially because she seemed almost on the verge of tears. I think I tried to make an excuse about having plans with my girlfriend, but before I could leave, Lily chose to kiss me without warning. It was uncomfortable too, to say the least. I got out of there and was happy to think that I wouldn't see her for a while. I came back to university after the summer, moving into a house with my friends. Without going off topic too, there were some serious issues in my friend group. A lot of petty arguing and worse, and I broke up with my girlfriend around the start of that school year as well. And basically the whole mess made me recontextualize things with Lily because it just suddenly didn't seem as bad. That said, I didn't want to be alone with her, that's for sure, but we mostly just talked online. I mean, she was still constantly messaging me after all. One upside of everything, though, is that I started dating a boy. Lily was not pleased to hear that news. I think she hoped to sneak in after I broke up with my girlfriend, but as I said before, that was never going to happen. There wasn't a big gap between my breakup and this new relationship too, so she must have thought that she missed her chance to be with me. But this is where the story gets weird. So at this time, I was fairly active on Tumblr. I occasionally talked about my life and mostly reblogged photos and stuff. I was on there one day too when something odd happened. One of the blogs that I followed had received an ask with some phrases that I recognized. It took me a second to register too that it was taken from my About page, and that made me freeze. I read the message properly, as someone was asking this completely random person to analyze a section of text from my page, asking for their opinion on the type of person who would write it. I cannot stress how messed up it was to see people talking about me like I was a character in a book that they were trying to study. The reply was basically, I don't know, sorry, but the important thing was that the question hadn't been anonymous. It linked to someone's blog. Obviously, I wanted to know who had taken such a bizarre interest in me. As far as I knew, no one in real life other than my boyfriend knew about my page. And well, no prizes for guessing who was behind it. But what I found was creepy. It was like a shrine. She was using a fake name, but I recognized Lily all over that thing. It was this cutesy pink and red page. There were a few posts about her interests, but most of the content was focused on her primary interest, me. Most of the posts were about me. There were accounts of things that I'd done recently, like he told me about such and such, and he went to a nightclub recently, etc., as well as references to things from as far back as I'd known her, really. It was clear that she had been keeping tabs on me, both online and offline, gathering up every scrap of information that she could about my life and hoarding it here in her creepy collection. She talked about us eating lunch together and how special our dates had been to her, as if it was anything more than acquaintance getting food after class. She talked about the time that she had forcibly kissed me in the woods, but wrote it off as if it had been mutual. She quoted lyrics from my favorite song and talked about how she'd always be there for me, no matter who else came into my life. There were lots of references to loving me just the way that he is, which answered another mystery about an anonymous love letter that I'd received earlier that year with the same wording. But it got worse. You see, there were a lot of posts about my boyfriend as well. These weren't so nice. In fact, they got vicious, talking about how he didn't deserve me, he didn't know what he had. If she was with me, she'd be jealous of anyone else who came near me, so my boyfriend not being a jealous person meant that he didn't love me. It was angry and hateful, and I didn't like to think about the sort of person who could write so obsessively being fixated on me. One thing that didn't make any sense at first was that the blog also made plenty of references to Lily's best friend, Steven. She had never mentioned this person to me. Her post talked a lot about Steven and how great a friend he was, and how much fun they had together, how he looked out for her, etc. I was trying to work out whether this was an online friend when one specific post made it all click. You see, she had posted a photo and captioned it with "Steven sent this to me. He knew that I would like it and I love it," or something like that. The problem was that the photo, it was taken from my own page. I hadn't sent it to her. She took it from my page and then claimed that this fictional best friend of hers shared it with her because in her head, she'd split me into two people or something. In her messed up fantasy life, I was both the perfect best friend who was always looking out for her, and her soulmate who was bound to end up with her when I finally got over my sweet, kind boyfriend and all the other easy girls I hung out with that she made dozens of posts complaining about. And who was she complaining to? Well, Lily, she had an audience. She asked open questions about me and her relationship with me and got messages back from her followers, people who took what she said at face value. I saw a bunch of random people agreeing with this stalker that my boyfriend didn't deserve me and that we were bound to break up soon so that I could be with Lily, the person that I was allegedly clearly supposed to be with. She had this fake fanfiction version of my life up for anyone to share their opinion on, and she'd made herself out to be the hero of it all. I went maybe a month back into this page's history. I didn't look at everything that was there. It was too much, so I'm not sure how long this had actually been going on for. Needless to say, though, I sent Lily a message confronting her about the blog. She said nothing, and I cannot stress how weird it was to have found pages and pages dedicated to me, with her talking about how she was in love with me and would make sure that we ended up together, slamming my boyfriend and building a fantasy life with two different versions of me in it that she clearly believed to be real. Then, acting like it hadn't happened. She said nothing. She didn't address it. She just changed the subject, even after I pushed. And it was like she hadn't even registered what I'd said. I've never seen anything else like it. It was weird. She deleted the page, of course, or at least changed the name and hid it, so I never found it again. But it wasn't the end, though. I wasn't going to hang out with her anymore, but we were still shoved together in classes, and she had started actually to scare me with what she might do next. I'm kind of a paranoid person, to be honest, and knowing that someone was obsessively keeping track of me for who knows how long really freaked me out. The next thing she tried to pull, though, was trying to seduce my boyfriend. It was an absolutely useless attempt that only made him uncomfortable. He told me about it right away, but what was her plan there? Did she hope to tell me that he cheated and waited for me to break up with him? Why would I want her after that? When that didn't work out for her, she tried hitting on 3 of my other friends. None of them took the bait, mind you, but she ended up dating one of my former housemates for a while, but she made sure to send me messages while they were together letting me know that she'd rather be with me. No thanks. Lily made sure to stay in my life the whole time that I was at university. There was a time when I tried to pull away from her, and she ended up starting rumors about me and damaging a career opportunity that I put a lot of work into. I don't know what else she did behind my back, but it made me realize that it was safer to let her think that she was part of my life while just ignoring her, rather than doing something that would cause her to get angry like that. After I graduated, Lily still wanted to spend time together, but I knew that I didn't have to. I made excuses about work and barely talked to her after that point. I almost entirely stopped posting on social media that I knew she knew about. Of course, she didn't give up that easily. She tried to start conversations, asked me to meet up with her, attempts that I usually ignored. I didn't like to think that she was still tracking me online, but she probably was. I don't know how to, but she'd occasionally reference things that I mentioned online somewhere she shouldn't have known about, really. The last time that we had a real conversation, though, she sent me a message out of nowhere. We hadn't spoken at all in months, and we hadn't talked about anything serious in a much longer time than that. Thinking about that conversation, though, it still makes my skin crawl. But I'll try and summarize what happened. So at first she asked me some questions about how long had I known that I was queer. I told her some basic stuff, the kind of thing like I'd tell anyone who asked. Then she changed the subject. She started talking about how I would feel about her if she was a boy, about wanting to be a boy for me. The messages quickly became fetishistic. She went into plenty of detail about the fantasies that she had of the two of us. Again, we were not friends at this point. We'd never been especially close, at least not from my perspective, and we'd barely spoken for years. But at this point, it was clear that we were not friends. I can't imagine sending messages like that to even a close friend, mind you, let alone someone who barely knows you. I tried telling her not to pull this on me, but she decided to change tactics. She sent photos of herself, followed by a bunch of messages, maybe 4 or 5 a minute, way too fast for me to reply before the next one arrived. basically quoting back what I'd told her about myself and my past earlier. She was telling me these things as if they had happened to her. She was role-playing as me. And the worst part was that she seemed to believe that it was real, that those things actually had happened to her, even when she was quoting me word for word. Things that I'd told her only hours before were now her life. It was like she was trying to absorb my history or something, to take it over, to make my life part of her. Yeah, I didn't talk to her again after that. I ignored future attempts that she made to talk to me, and I eventually silently deleted her from the inactive social media, which was her only way of really contacting me. I really thought that she might finally move on, to be honest, as well. But a few days ago, she sent me a new friend request. It's sitting there, unanswered, because I know if I delete it, she'll only send another one. Lily and I, we met nearly 12 years ago now. This story is just the highlights. And even then, it's only the stuff that I know about for sure. A lot more happened behind my back. I know it did. Anyway, this is my life, and it's not what I wanted or asked for, but it's something that I just have to live with now. In 2008, I was driving from New Orleans, LA to Eugene, OR. It was just me, 22-year-old female, and my year-old pit bull in a 14-foot U-Haul truck with everything that I owned crammed into the back, a fancy flip phone, and my printout MapQuest directions. I think the first smartphones actually came out around that time, but I didn't have one. Cell phone service was also much spottier, and there were long stretches through the desert where I had zero service for hundreds of miles. So, I was driving a lonely stretch of highway through central Texas when I realized I hadn't seen a town or an exit for a very long time, and my giant U-Haul was really low on gas now. Just when I'm starting to freak out and seriously run out of gas, I see a small town coming up. I pull into this town, and it is tiny. I was so worried about other things that I never did pay attention to the name of the town, but there were only like 6 streets in the whole place. In any case, I go and gas up and am ready to get back on the road. Except, I cannot for the life of me find my way back to the highway. I circle the town about 4 times, I would guess, and start getting so frustrated because this is such a tiny town. So how the heck can I not find my way out? I can literally see the highway, but for some reason I just can't get onto it. I returned to the gas station to ask for directions. When I got gas, I paid at the pump and never actually went in. But when I enter for the directions, there's a skinny, sort of nondescript guy who has black hair hanging down in the front of his eyes that looks like it could use a good wash. He's not particularly creepy or anything, but a little rude. He never really met my eyes. He was looking down at a magazine. He gives me directions that don't sound right at all. He's telling me to take a road that will get me to the highway in about 17 miles. For a moment, though, I am just dumbfounded. Then I point out that I didn't drive that far to get from the highway into the town, so why so far to get back to the highway? I mean, I can literally see it from the town. He is really casual, almost like I'm just an annoyance and can follow his directions or not. Why should he care? He gives me some explanation about the road curving around that doesn't really make sense. He still doesn't look at me, mind you. He still doesn't look at me too. Just whatever. I gave you the directions and waved his hand in the direction of the door. When I got into the parking lot, my whole body started trembling violently and my heart started racing, seemingly for no reason. I get into the truck, and as soon as I put my key into the ignition, I just burst into tears. I had the most terrible feeling that no matter how nonchalant he acted, this man had bad intentions. I didn't know what, but I knew right then and there that there was no way that I was going to follow his directions. Yet, This was the only store in this little town, and short of knocking on doors, no thank you, and there was really nobody else to ask for directions. So I decided, you know what, I don't care if this town seemed like something dropped out of the Twilight Zone. I was going to drive around until I just found my own way out, even if it took all night. But then, a big red beater of a pickup truck, as much rust as metal, pulls up and disgorges the quintessential Texan man, huge, husky, and in flannel and work boots. Without even thinking about it, I jumped out of the truck and approached him quickly yet warily. Looking into his eyes, I saw a kind human being, or at least I was hoping I did, I think. I asked him if he could please give me directions to the highway. I told him that I knew it was silly, but I just couldn't seem to find my way back. He looked concerned, as I was visibly upset, so he made me laugh and very cheerfully gave me directions for a hairpin turn turnoff right at the end of a small concrete tunnel that I had passed several times. He said that it often confused travelers because it was so hard to see. They need to put up signs, etc. With a sinking feeling in my stomach, though, I asked him how far in miles was it back to the highway. He laughed and gave me a funny look. Miles, miss? I'd say it's a quarter of a mile at most. You can see the highway right from here. At this point, I couldn't help it. I had to know. What happens if I drive? And I gave him the directions the man in the store had given me. Texas looked at me very intently and asked me how I knew about that route. It was pretty far out, and usually only locals know about it, so I told him. He was quiet for a few minutes, and then asked what the attendant looked like, and if I had a map of the state. No, just my map quest, which wasn't really helpful in this situation at all. He goes to his truck and grabs a really raggedy local map from his glove box. Spreading it out for me, he traces the route that I described, and the way that the man from the gas station had told me to go led away from town, away from the interstate, and led to seemingly the middle of nowhere. Texas told me that the road did go about 17 miles, right before it dead-ended in the desert. I asked him what was out there, and he told me that it was nothing but some junked cars and a few trailers and mobile homes, all owned by the same family. And this family was known locally as troublemakers, meth heads, and alcoholics, and these were the nice things townspeople apparently had to say about them. Also, the erstwhile clerk was a part of this family and lived down that road. But I'll never forget the look in Texas's eyes as he told me this. He also told me that I was smart to listen to my instincts, and he told me to be careful traveling out there. Now, I don't know if the man from the gas station wanted what was in the back of my U-Haul or was in the driver's seat, but thankfully, because of Texas, I didn't have to find out. Oh, and I learned that sometimes angels look like ruddy-haired Texans with scruffy faces and rusty pickups. So thank you, random Texan stranger. You really saved my butt that day, and I'll always remember you with tons of love. Sorry I didn't ask your name, too, but I guess now you're forever Texas to me.